So back to this thing that you're doing. First of all, what are you calling this?
I can't tell you that yet.
Okay. So you're trying to, one of the things you were saying is you're trying to generate a story.
Yeah, we're trying to invite everybody to the table, and we're trying to get the right story. And we'll know it's the right story because people will say voluntarily, yeah, I could really go for that.
What do you mean by story when you're saying the right story?
Well, a vision.
Okay.
Well, I would say it's something, if you wanted to think about it archetypally, it's something like a vision of the promised land.
A structure.
So, yeah, well, you have to, okay, we could talk about that technically. A story is a description of a hierarchy, A story is a description of a hierarchy of attentional prioritization. So what do I mean by that? There's an infinite number of things to look at in the world. So perception seems technically impossible because you just drown in the complexity. That's what happens in a psychedelic trip. You drown in the complexity. And it's real, that complexity. Now, usually that's shielded from you. It's veiled from you, like God is veiled from you. It's the same thing. And so it's veiled by the fact that you regard some things as more important than others. And you do that implicitly. And so, for example, right now, you're devoting most of your cognitive and perceptual resources to my face and to what I'm saying. Right? Now, there's lots of things you could be looking at in this room or thinking about, right? There's an infinite number of things. But you're not. You're weighting some things more heavily. Now, why? Well, why are we having this conversation? Well, I could ask you, why are we having this conversation?
Because I'm curious. I want to know how you think.
Okay.
I want to know what your plans are.
What goal do you think your curiosity serves?
Better understanding of what you're trying to accomplish.
Okay. Why do you think other people are interested in that? Because they're going to watch this. Why do you think people are interested in that?
Because what you're saying makes sense. And we also recognize that there's a real flaw in the way our society is constructed, and there's a real genuine threat in allowing these power structures to sort of maintain this narrative and create this narrative that's based upon them gaining control over resources, our economics, our energy, and socially what we do and what we don't do.
Okay, so now
that serves them.
Okay, so do you see that partially what you're involved in insofar as you're doing it right is something like, what would you say, a cautionary tale about the possibility of tyranny?
Yes.
Okay, so you can see how that ties into an archetypal story,
certainly.
Right?
And I think that's the big threat. Now, that's what people are terrified of when they see Klaus Schwab standing there with a Darth Vader outfit telling people that they're going to eat bugs.
Okay, and you're using the technology of free communication as an antidote to that.
Yes.
Okay, so then I would say archetypally what you're doing is you're doing something like serving the divine word that makes habitable order out of chaos as an antidote to tyranny. That's a story, and it's a deep story. And if you weren't acting out a deep story, you wouldn't have tens of millions of people listening to you. The fact that it's like J.K. Rowling. It's like, why is she so popular? Well, she told an archetypal story masterfully. It has a religious substructure. It just got people, like hundreds of millions of people and produced billions of dollars. You have to see the world through a story. You act out a story. And the reason we like stories is because it's actually pretty hard to see the world, and it's really useful to see the world the way other people see it, just in case they know something you don't. And so we're telling each other stories all the time. We're acting out stories. A description of the pattern we're acting out, that is a story. And when you go to a movie, maybe you see the hero on the screen. It's James Bond. And that's the same. It's the same narrative in some sense. It's a bit more stereotyped, but Bond is, this sophisticated, aggressive guy who's got his aggression under control, who's fighting the Hydra. And it's not the Hydra in James Bond. I don't remember the name of the underground organization there, but it's a Hydra for the Marvel heroes. Mm-hmm. The Hydra is an amalgam of tyranny and chaos, right? It's a Hydra with head of snakes. Paralyzes you when you look at it. It's an archetypal narrative. And the fundamental question of life is, what is the proper orienting narrative? That's the same question as, what God do you worship? It's the reason I entitled my next book, We Who Wrestle with God, because you're stuck with that no matter what. You're wrestling with one God or another all the time. God's an animating spirit. That's one way of thinking about it. It's more than that, but that's one way of thinking about it. And so I constantly look to these old stories, these archetypal stories, you know, as a student of Jung, let's say, to find out what the proper orienting pathway is. And that's embedded in tradition. You know, the stories that have lasted. Richard Dawkins would have got to this conclusion if he would have pursued his thought far enough. Because an archetype is a stable meme, propagates across time. And there's some memes, some stories, let's say, that stabilize you as an individual. They restrict your anxiety. They provide you with hope. They make you productive and generous. And when they're extended, they produce a structure that unites people and produces productive peace. You know, and it's not by fluke, for example, that the America itself is founded in no small part on the motivational force of something like the Exodus narrative. That was certainly the case for the civil rights movement. It has to be that way because Exodus is an archetypal story about the establishment of proper order as an alternative to the tyrant and the desert. So everyone is always doing that in their life, whether they know it or not. You know, and you do it extremely well, if you don't mind the insult of a compliment. And I think the reason for that is that for whatever reason, you are acutely aware of your own ignorance and always trying to rectify it. And I would say that's a reflection of a practice of humility. You know, I know you're a competent guy and you're no pushover, and so calling you humble is kind of a weird thing to do. But one of the things that I've been very pleased about constantly when talking to you is it's a conversation, man. You know, what are we trying to do? We're trying to make things clear. We're trying to figure out what the hell's going on. We're trying to say what we think. We're trying to jointly make each other wiser, you know, hopefully to the degree we were able to manage it, and we're inviting people along for the ride. And they seem pretty happy about that. And that's partly because people aren't just oriented by power. You know, there's all these truckers out there who are listening to this podcast while they're driving their rigs across the country. You know, what are they trying to do? They're trying to get their acts together. They're trying to understand. You know, they're trying to take their proper position in the social world. And that's a fundamentally compelling, it's not a drive, it's an orienting and integrating spirit. It's the same as the spirit of Yahweh in the Old Testament. It's exactly the same thing. It's the same thing. So one of the things I learned about the biblical narrative, this is so cool. This is what the next book's about. So imagine there's two possible states. One of disunity and chaos. You're going in every direction at the same time. And one of relative unity. Now the unity can turn into tyranny. And the multiplicity can turn into chaos. Those are the two dangers. But imagine there's a proper unity that stops you from being anxious. Anxiety is a marker of internal disunity of narrative.